The helicopter's rotors faded into the gray nothing above us, leaving that special kind of silence you only get in Antarctica. Like the world just stopped existing beyond this little bubble of warmth and metal we called Berkner Station. I watched the black speck disappear completely before turning back to the 5 recruits standing around like they'd just been dropped on Mars, which, honestly, wasn't that far off. "Right then," I said, pulling my hands deeper into my coat pockets. "Welcome to the edge of nowhere. I'm Gary Spencer, and for the next 4 months I'm the only thing standing between you and becoming a popsicle with a name tag." The redhead, Julie, according to my clipboard, was still staring at the spot where the helicopter had vanished. Kid looked like she was watching her last connection to civilization disappear, which was pretty much exactly what had just happened. The tall guy with the skeptical eyebrows had to be Ian, and he was already looking around like he was cataloging everything that didn't meet his standards, which, given where we were, was probably everything. "Sun goes down in about an hour," I continued, herding them toward the main building. Except down is a generous term. More like it crawls behind the horizon and stays there for the next 4 months. So if anyone's planning on working on their tan, you're about 18 weeks too late. The wind picked up as we reached the door, sending ice crystals skittering across the snow like tiny knives. I punched in the entry code. Same code they'd used for the past 3 years because, apparently, security through obscurity was our level of sophistication out here. The common room hit us with a blast of heated air that felt like stepping into an oven after spending 10 minutes in a freezer. The space was functional in that special military way. Everything bolted down, nothing fancy, designed by people who'd never actually had to live here. A few mismatched couches arranged around a coffee table that had seen better decades. A kitchenette that worked when it felt like it, and windows that showed you exactly how much nothing surrounded us on all sides. "Take a seat anywhere," I said, watching them spread out. "We've got some ground rules to cover before the real fun starts." Julie picked a chair that gave her a clear view of the northern door. Interesting choice. Ian dropped onto the couch with the air of someone who was already composing complaints in his head. Hayden had to be the academic one based on how she was pulling out a notebook like this was a college lecture, claimed a spot where she could see everyone. Dustin settled quietly into a corner chair, hands folded, looking like the kind of student who never caused trouble, but always passed his classes. "First things first," I began, falling into the routine I'd perfected over 30-odd briefings. "Berkner Station operates on 6 simple rules. Follow them, and you'll still have all your fingers and toes when the helicopter comes back in April. Break them and..." I let that hang in the air for a second. Amazing how effective a well-timed pause could be. Rule 1. No one goes outside after dark. Period. I don't care if you see Santa Claus doing jumping jacks in the snow. You stay inside. Ian snorted. Actually snorted like I had just told him his horoscope. "What's out there? Polar bears? I thought this was Antarctica, not the Arctic." "Polar bears are the least of your problems," I said. "But since you asked, let's just say the wildlife around here doesn't follow normal patterns." Hayden scribbled something in her notebook. Julie hadn't stopped staring at that northern door, and it was starting to bug me. Dustin nodded along like every word was gospel. "Rule 2, I continued. "If you hear voices calling your name from outside, especially from the north side of the building, you ignore them completely. Doesn't matter if it sounds like your mother, your best friend, or the Queen of England asking you out for tea." "Come on," Ian said, shifting forward on the couch. "You're talking like there's something supernatural out there. This is a research station, not a ghost story." "You're right," I said. "It's not a ghost story. Ghost stories have better endings." That shut him up for about 10 seconds, which was probably a record. Rule 3. If you see people in blue maintenance uniforms anywhere around the station, you acknowledge them politely but don't engage in conversation. They do their job, you do yours, everyone goes home happy. Julie flinched. Actually flinched, like I'd just slapped her. Now that was interesting. The maintenance crew comes by every few weeks, I continued, watching her carefully. They keep the generators running and the pipes from freezing. Nice enough folks, but they work better without distractions. How many people are in the crew? Hayden asked, pen poised. 3, usually. Sometimes 4 if there's heavy work to do. And they just show up? No radio contact? They know their schedule better than we do. Been working this route longer than I've been stationed here. Julie was gripping the arms of her chair now. Whatever was bothering her about the maintenance crew, it was more than just casual interest. Rule 4. The radio is for emergencies only, and I mean real emergencies. Medical disasters, structural failures, equipment that might kill us all. Not for calling home because you miss your girlfriend. How do we define emergency? Dustin asked quietly. First time he'd spoken since the helicopter dropped them off. Anything that poses immediate danger to station personnel. Use your judgment, but use it carefully. Every transmission goes through me first. Rule 5. We maintain regular sleep schedules and meal times. I know it sounds like summer camp, but your body needs routine when the sun disappears for 4 months. Depression and disorientation are real problems out here. Hayden was writing faster now, like she was documenting everything for posterity. Ian was examining his fingernails with the kind of attention that meant he thought this was all ridiculous. Dustin kept nodding. And Julie. Julie was staring at that door like it might open any second. Rule 6, and this is the big one. If anything seems wrong, and I mean anything at all, you come to me immediately. Don't try to solve problems on your own. Don't assume you know better. This place has ways of making smart people do stupid things. I paused, looking at each of them in turn. Any questions so far? Ian raised his hand with mock formality. Yeah, just one. What exactly are you protecting us from? Because this whole presentation feels like you're trying to scare us with campfire stories. I'm trying to keep you alive, I said. Whether you believe me or not is entirely up to you. But what's the actual threat? Hayden asked, pen still moving. Environmental hazards? Equipment failures? Wildlife? I'd been doing these briefings for 3 years. Same questions, same skeptical faces, same need to know what was out there in the dark. Usually I deflected with jokes about cabin fever and frostbite. Keep it light. Keep them focused on the rules without dwelling too much on the reasons behind them. But something about this group felt different. They weren't just asking questions, they were asking the right questions. Like they already knew some of the answers. Let's just say that isolation does strange things to people, I said finally. And this particular corner of Antarctica has a history of unusual incidents. What kind of incidents? Julie asked, speaking for the first time since we'd come inside. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not curiosity. More like confirmation. Equipment failures, people wandering off in the middle of the night, breakdowns in communication. I kept my tone neutral, professional. Nothing we can't handle if everyone follows the rules. Has anyone ever... Julie hesitated, then pushed forward. Has anyone ever gone missing, from this station specifically? The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 10 degrees. Ian stopped examining his nails. Hayden's pen paused mid-sentence. Dustin went very still. We've had personnel transfers, I said carefully. People who couldn't handle the isolation or who had family emergencies back home. But no one who just disappeared? I studied her face, looking for some clue about where this was going. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of outdoor tan that came from real work rather than vacation time. Her jacket was good quality but well used, and she wore a silver ring on her right hand that looked like it might belong to someone else. Why do you ask? Julie's fingers tightened on the chair arms. I was just wondering about the safety record. You know, making sure this place has proper protocols. She was lying. Not badly, but she was definitely lying. Safety is our top priority, I said, still watching her. "That's why we have the rules." "What about Daniel Brady?" she asked, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What happened to him?" The room went dead silent. Even the heater seemed to quiet down, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I hadn't mentioned Daniel to anyone in months. His name wasn't on any of the official documentation these recruits would have seen. Hell, most of his paperwork had been classified or transferred to other departments after the incident. "How do you know that name?" I asked. Julie's face had gone pale, but her jaw was set with the kind of determination that usually preceded really bad decisions. "He was stationed here 2 years ago, wasn't he? Young guy, brown hair, probably asked too many questions." My mouth had gone dry. Daniel Brady had been here exactly 2 years ago. Brown hair, constant questions, and a habit of staring at that same northern door that Julie couldn't seem to stop looking at. "Julie," I said slowly, "how exactly do you know about Daniel Brady?" She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her weighing her options. Whatever she'd come here to find, Daniel was part of it. "Because," she said finally, "he's my brother, and I want to know what really happened to him." The heater kicked back on with a mechanical whir that sounded too loud in the silence. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows like something was testing them for weaknesses. 3 years of briefings, and I'd never had anyone ask about Daniel Brady. 3 years of carefully managed personnel rotations and sanitized incident reports. And now his sister was sitting in my common room, demanding answers I wasn't sure I could give, because the truth about Daniel Brady was the kind of truth that made people stop following rules. And in Antarctica, people who stopped following rules had a habit of walking out into the snow and never coming back, just like Daniel had. 3 hours later, I was lying in my bunk staring at the ceiling and wondering why I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to go sideways. The Outpost had settled into that particular kind of quiet you only get when civilization is 1,000 miles away and the temperature outside would kill you in minutes. Should have been peaceful. Should have helped me sleep. Instead, I kept thinking about the way Julie had said her brother's name. Like she was testing it, seeing how I'd react. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't belong to someone heading for the bathroom or grabbing a midnight snack. I rolled out of bed and grabbed my jacket, then stepped into the corridor just as the footsteps stopped. Ian stood at the far end of the hallway, maybe 20 feet from the main observation window. Just standing there in his ridiculous jeans and hoodie, staring out at the black nothing beyond the glass. "Hey," I called softly. "Ian." He didn't turn around, didn't even twitch, just kept staring out that window like he was watching the most fascinating movie ever made. I walked over and grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. His eyes had this glassy, unfocused look like he was sleepwalking with his eyes open. "What the hell are you doing?" I kept my voice low but firm. Rule 1, remember, no looking out windows after dark. Ian blinked a few times and awareness slowly crept back into his face. What? You were staring out the window. For how long?" "I wasn't." He looked back at the glass, then at me, confusion replacing the blank expression. "I just heard something. Thought I saw lights moving out there." "What kind of lights?" "Patterns, like signals or something. Moving in circles, then straight lines, then..." He shook his head. "It doesn't make sense. But they were organized, you know? Not random." I grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the window. "Listen to me very carefully. There are no lights out there. Nothing moves in patterns. And even if there were, you don't look. That's the whole point of the rule. But if someone's in trouble, then they're already dead." The words came out harsher than I meant, but Ian needed to understand. "This isn't the suburbs, kid. Nobody survives out there after dark." We walked back toward the common room, and I could hear the quiet hum of electronics from inside. Someone else was still awake. Hayden sat at the main table with her laptop open, surrounded by notebooks and what looked like printed pages. Her glasses reflected the screen's glow as she scrolled through something that had her complete attention. "Research project?" I asked. She looked up, blinking like she'd forgotten other people existed. "Personnel records. I was trying to cross-reference the station's history with climate data, but there are huge gaps in the documentation." "What kind of gaps?" "Missing months, entire seasons where there's no record of who was stationed here or what research was being conducted." She turned the laptop toward me. "Look at this." The screen showed a spreadsheet with dates, names, and assignment details. But Hayden was right. There were chunks missing, blocks of time with no entries at all. "Where did you get this?" "Public research databases. Antarctic research stations are supposed to maintain detailed records for safety and scientific purposes, but Berkner Station's files look like someone took scissors to them." Ian leaned over my shoulder to see the screen. "When was the last complete record?" "About 5 years ago. Since then, it's all fragments. Personnel arriving, but no record of them leaving. Equipment requests with no follow-up reports. And look at this." She clicked on another tab. "Missing persons reports filed by families, but no official responses from the Antarctic program." My stomach dropped as I saw the list of names. 12 people over 5 years, all last stationed at Berkner. All of them listed as missing with no official explanation. Daniel Brady was third from the bottom. "Jesus," Ian whispered. "How did you access this?" I asked. "It's public information. Took some digging, but families have the right to know what happened to their relatives." Hayden looked at me over her glasses. "Which brings up an interesting question. What did happen to them?" Before I could answer, Julie appeared in the doorway. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. Pale, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "Gary," she said, "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Have you been hearing voices tonight?" The question hit me like cold water. "What kind of voices?" "Someone calling my name. From outside, I think. It started about an hour ago." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I know what you said about ignoring voices, but it sounds so real, like someone's in trouble." "You haven't looked outside?" "No. I've been sitting on my bed with my back to the window, trying not to listen. But it's getting louder." Ian straightened up. "I told you I saw lights. What if someone really is out there?" "Nobody is out there," I said firmly. "This is exactly what I was talking about. This place gets into your head. But what if—" "No." I turned to face all three of them. "This is not a discussion. The rules exist for good reasons, and those reasons don't change just because you're hearing things or seeing lights." Dustin's voice came from the kitchen area, quiet and careful. "Gary, I think you need to hear this." We all turned to find him standing by the radio console, headphones in one hand. He looked like he'd been there for a while. "What is it?" "The radio's been active for the past hour. Voices, but they're—" He hesitated. "They're speaking in different languages. Sometimes English, sometimes what sounds like Spanish or maybe German. And the transmissions are coming from different locations, but they're all talking about the same thing. Which is? They're asking for help, all of them. Different voices, different languages, but the same message." Dustin's face was troubled. "They know our call sign, they know we're here." I took the headphones and listened. Static filled my ears, then voices fading in and out like distant radio stations. A woman speaking rapid Spanish, a man with what sounded like a German accent, someone else whose words I couldn't make out at all. But Dustin was right. Underneath the language barriers, the message was consistent. Help, trapped, cold. And our station identifier, repeated over and over. "Have you responded?" I asked. "No. You said emergencies only, and I wasn't sure if this qualified." "It doesn't. Protocol is to monitor and report, nothing else." "But if people are in trouble," Julie started. then they're beyond our help. I pulled off the headphones and handed them back to Dustin. Radio silence until morning. Hayden was staring at her laptop screen again, but I could tell she was listening to every word. Ian kept glancing toward the windows. Julie looked like she wanted to argue but was holding herself back. And Dustin was watching all of us with the careful attention of someone who saw more than he let on. "I want everyone to go back to their rooms," I said. "Get some sleep. Morning watch starts at 0800 and we've got work to do." "Gary," Julie said quietly, "about Daniel. Tomorrow. We'll talk about your brother tomorrow." She nodded, but I could see she wasn't satisfied. None of them were. They all had that look people get when they know someone's not telling them the whole truth. As they filed out of the common room, I caught Dustin's arm. "How long have you been monitoring the radio?" "Since around 11. The voices started just after midnight. And before that? Normal chatter from other stations. Weather reports, equipment checks, nothing unusual." I studied his face, looking for any sign he was holding something back. But Dustin had the kind of expression that gave nothing away, polite, helpful, and completely unreadable. "Keep monitoring, but no transmissions, and if anything changes, wake me immediately." "Of course." After everyone had gone to their rooms, I stood alone in the common room and listened to the building settle around me, the heater cycling on and off, wind rattling the windows, the distant hum of generators keeping us alive in the middle of nowhere. But underneath all that, something else. A sound I couldn't quite identify, like voices whispering just below the threshold of hearing. I'd run this briefing 37 times over 3 years. New recruits always had trouble the first few nights. Weird dreams, imagined sounds, the psychological pressure of complete isolation. Usually took a week or two for people to adjust. But this group was different. They weren't just struggling with the isolation. They were being drawn to break specific rules. Ian staring out windows, Julie hearing voices calling her name, the radio suddenly active with impossible transmissions. And they were asking the right questions, about Daniel, about missing personnel, about things they shouldn't know to ask about. I walked over to the main window and carefully avoided looking outside. Instead, I checked the exterior camera feeds on the small monitor mounted beside it. Static. Every single camera showing nothing but white static. That wasn't normal. The cameras were hardened for Antarctic conditions, with backup power and redundant systems. They didn't just stop working all at once, unless something didn't want us to see what was out there. I turned away from the monitor and headed for my room, but I could feel the windows behind me like cold spots on my back. And somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, I could swear someone was calling my name. Just like they'd called to every recruit who disappeared from Berkner Station over the past 5 years. The difference was, this time I knew what was happening. I'd learned to recognize the signs, to spot the patterns. These 4 hadn't been randomly selected for this assignment. They'd been specifically chosen. The question was, chosen by whom? Morning came like a promise nobody intended to keep. 3 hours of gray light that barely qualified as dawn before the darkness swallowed us again. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, and from the looks of everyone at breakfast, I wasn't the only one having trouble with the whole concept of rest. Julie sat at the corner table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, bent over what looked like notebook pages covered in pencil marks. Her hair was still in yesterday's ponytail, and she had that hollow-eyed look that came from spending the night staring at the ceiling. "What's that you're working on?" I asked, dropping into the chair across from her. She looked up, startled, then quickly closed the notebook. "Nothing important." "Mind if I take a look?" "It's just..." She hesitated, then opened the notebook reluctantly. Sketches. The pages were covered with detailed floor plans. Not just rough drawings. These were precise layouts showing room dimensions, door locations, even the placement of furniture and equipment. The main building, the storage annexes, the generator shed. Hell, she'd even drawn the underground utility tunnels that connected everything. "How do you know about the tunnel system?" I asked. "I don't know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I kept seeing it in my head, like I'd been here before. "Have you?" "No, never. But I know where everything is, Gary. I know which door squeaks, which light switch doesn't work right, even where you keep the backup generator keys." She looked up at me with eyes that were close to panic. How is that possible? Before I could answer, her composure finally cracked. The notebook slid from her hands as she buried her face in her palms, shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs that come from weeks of holding everything inside. "I lied," she said through her fingers. "Not about Daniel being my brother, that's true, but about why I'm here." I waited, not trusting myself to speak, because suddenly I was remembering Daniel's last night, the way he'd stood at that northern door with his hand on the lock, insisting someone was calling for help. "My family didn't send me," Julie continued. "They don't even know I'm here. They think Daniel died in a climbing accident 6 months after he left Antarctica. That's what the official report said, that he'd been transferred to a research station in Colorado and died there in a fall. But you didn't believe it. Daniel was terrified of heights. He wouldn't have gone climbing, not voluntarily." She wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "So I started digging. Found out the Colorado station had no record of him. Found out none of the stations he was supposedly transferred to had any record of him. How did you end up here?" "I got accepted to the Antarctic program 6 months ago. Took every survival course I could find. Learned everything about polar operations." Her laugh was bitter. "Turns out I didn't need the training. I already knew this place." "Julie. He was here, wasn't he? Something happened to Daniel here, and now I'm seeing his memories somehow." She looked at me with desperate hope. "That means he's still alive, right? That's how this works?" I thought about Daniel's final night, how he'd insisted he could hear Julie calling his name from outside, how he'd been so certain his sister needed help that he'd tried to unlock the north door, how I'd had to physically restrain him while he screamed that he could hear her crying in the snow. Daniel had been seeing Julie's memories too, or something wearing her face had been showing them to him. "Gary?" Julie was staring at me, waiting for an answer I couldn't give. "We'll figure it out," I said, which was the best I could manage without lying outright. Hayden chose that moment to emerge from her research corner, laptop in hand, and the kind of expression that meant she'd found something that wouldn't make anyone's day better. "I need to show you both something," she said, setting the computer on the table. "I've been tracking the timeline of incidents at Berkner Station, cross-referencing them with geological surveys conducted in this area." The screen showed a detailed map of the region with survey points marked in different colors. Most were clustered around other research stations, but there was a concentration of red dots directly beneath our location. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "Deep core drilling samples from 2014. The survey team was looking for mineral deposits, but they found something else." She clicked to a new tab showing a scan of an official report. "Anomalous readings at a depth of approximately 800 meters. Electromagnetic irregularities. Temperature variations that defied explanation." "What kind of irregularities?" "The core samples showed evidence of organic material that shouldn't exist at that depth or in those conditions. But here's the interesting part. The survey was terminated abruptly after only 3 weeks, and all the data was classified." Julie leaned forward to read the screen. "When was this?" 6 months before the first disappearance." Hayden adjusted her glasses. "Since then, the supernatural incidents have escalated every year. More missing personnel, more equipment failures, more reports of unusual phenomena." "You're saying they drilled into something," I said. "I'm saying they woke something up." Ian wandered over from the kitchen, drawn by the serious tone of our conversation. "What are we talking about?" Geological surveys that went wrong, Hayden said. Want to see something really interesting? She pulled up another document, a budget allocation for emergency containment procedures at remote Antarctic facilities. The dollar amounts were staggering, and most of the line items were redacted. Containment of what? Ian asked. That's the question, isn't it? Hayden said. But whatever it is, someone's spending a lot of money to keep it quiet. Ian studied the documents with the kind of focus that meant his skepticism was finally starting to crack. So what you're saying is that there really is something dangerous here, not just isolation and cabin fever. I'm saying the evidence suggests something was disturbed, and people have been paying the price ever since. Then why are we here? Julie asked. Why do they keep sending people to this place? I could have told them the truth, that we weren't here to conduct research or maintain equipment. We were here because something needed feeding, and fresh minds were easier to copy than ones that had already learned to resist. But that conversation would have to wait until I was sure who I was talking to. I'll take evening radio watch, Ian announced suddenly. No, I said immediately. I handle all radio communication. Come on, Gary, I'm not going to break any rules. Just want to monitor for emergency transmissions, maybe catch some weather updates from other stations. Ian, I know what I'm doing. Back home, I was licensed for amateur radio operations. I know proper protocols. Something about the way he said it bothered me. Too confident, too eager. Like he was volunteering for more than just radio duty. Fine, I said finally, but monitoring only. No transmissions without clearance. Of course. The rest of the day crawled by with the kind of tension that builds before a storm. Julie spent most of it sketching more layouts, her hand moving across the paper like she was copying from blueprints only she could see. Hayden disappeared into her research, occasionally muttering about classified documents and cover-ups. Dustin helped with routine maintenance, quiet and efficient as always. And Ian kept checking his watch, counting down the hours until his radio shift. Around midnight, I was jerked awake by Dustin shaking my shoulder. Gary, you need to get to the radio room, now. I pulled on my jacket and followed him down the corridor, immediately noticing that the common room lights were on and voices were coming from the radio corner. Ian sat at the console with the headphones on, speaking into the microphone with calm authority. Copy that, Station Baker 7. What's your current position? Ian! I crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed the headphones away from him. What the hell are you doing? Emergency transmission, he said, looking genuinely confused by my anger. Someone's in trouble out there. I put on the headphones and immediately heard a voice crackling through the static, weak, desperate, barely audible over the interference. Hello? Is anyone there? This is Dr. Marcus Webb, Station Baker 7. We're lost in the storm, and our GPS is malfunctioning. Please respond. Where are you? Ian asked, reaching for the microphone. I yanked it away from him. No transmissions. But he's lost. He needs help. There is no Station Baker 7, I said. I know every facility within 500 miles, and that call sign doesn't exist. Ian stared at me like I'd lost my mind, but I just talked to him. He said they've been walking for hours, trying to find shelter. You gave him our location? Of course. He needs to know where to. I switched off the radio mid-transmission, cutting off the voice that was still calling for help. Ian lunged for the switch, but Dustin grabbed his arms and held him back. Let me go. Someone's gonna die out there. Ian, listen to me, I said, keeping my voice steady. There's nobody out there. That transmission isn't real. You're crazy. I heard him clear as anything. Through the radio room's small window, I could see a figure standing in the snow about 50 yards from the building. Blue maintenance uniform, perfectly still despite the wind that was whipping snow across the compound. The figure looked exactly like Daniel Brady. I blinked, and it was gone. Did you see that? I asked Dustin. See what? I looked back at the window, but there was nothing except darkness and falling snow. Ian had stopped struggling and was staring at the radio with the same glassy expression he'd had the night before. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why wouldn't you let me help?" "Because," I said, still watching the window, "the people you think you're helping are already dead." The radio crackled once, then went silent. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows like something was testing them for weaknesses. The silence stretched for maybe 30 seconds before Ian blinked and seemed to come back to himself. The glassy look faded from his eyes, replaced by confusion and something that might have been fear. "I don't understand," he said again, but this time his voice sounded different, less certain. The transmission was so clear. "That's the point," I said, switching the radio completely off. "It's supposed to sound real." Dustin was still holding Ian's arms, but gently now, more like steadying him than restraining him. "Are you okay?" Ian nodded slowly, then looked at the radio console like it had personally betrayed him. But I heard him. Dr. Webb. He knew our call sign, knew exactly where we were. "Because it's been listening," I said. "Learning, that's what it does." "What does?" Julie's voice came from the doorway. She'd appeared without any of us noticing, still holding her notebook but looking more alert than she had all day. I looked at the three of them standing there, Ian confused and shaken, Dustin watchful, Julie demanding answers, and realized I was out of time for half-truths and careful omissions. "Something under the ice," I said. "Something that shouldn't exist but does anyway." The next morning came gray and bitter, with wind that cut through the building's walls like they were made of paper. I was checking the generator readings when I heard the rumble of engines approaching from the south. "Maintenance crew," I announced to the common room. "Everyone stay inside and let them work." Julie looked up from her coffee. "I thought they weren't scheduled until next week." "They don't follow schedules. They come when they need to come." Through the main window, I watched three figures in blue uniforms climb out of a tracked vehicle that looked older than the station itself. They moved with the kind of easy familiarity that came from years of routine, heading straight for the generator shed without any apparent discussion about who would do what. Hayden peered over her laptop. "Should we introduce ourselves?" "No, they know who we are." The crew worked for 3 hours, moving between buildings with tools that seemed too clean for field maintenance. I offered them coffee when they came inside to check the heating system, but they just nodded politely and kept working. That was when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. They never actually drank the coffee. They'd take the cups, hold them, even bring them halfway to their lips, but I never saw any of them actually swallow. And their tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, diagnostic equipment, made no sound when they used them, not even the whisper of metal on metal. Ian watched them work with fascination, asking questions about the heating system and getting responses that were technically correct but felt rehearsed, like they were reciting lines from a script. "How long have you been working Antarctic stations?" Ian asked the tallest one, a middle-aged man with graying hair. "Long enough," the man replied without looking up from the control panel he was examining. "Must be tough work, the isolation, the weather. You get used to it." Ian tried a few more questions, but the responses were all variations of the same polite non-answers. Eventually he gave up and went back to the common room, leaving me alone with the crew. They finished their work just as efficiently as they'd started it, packing their tools with movements that looked normal but felt wrong somehow. Too synchronized, like they were following choreography instead of individual decisions. As they headed for the door, the tall one turned back to me. "Station's in good condition," he said. "Should run smooth through the dark season." "Thanks." He nodded and started to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Spencer? Yeah? Keep your people inside after dark. Weather's going to get worse before it gets better." Something about the way he said it made me check the weather reports after they left. No storms predicted, no temperature drops. Just the usual Antarctic winter that we were already experiencing. Julie cornered me an hour later while I was inventorying supplies in the storage area. "We need to talk," she said, and her tone made it clear this wasn't a request. About what? About storage room C. I stopped counting battery packs and looked at her carefully. There is no storage room C. Bull. She pulled out her notebook and flipped to a page covered with floor plans. I've drawn every room in this building, Gary. Multiple times. And there's always a storage room C between the generator access and the back wall. Julie, I found the door yesterday. It's unmarked, but it's there. And it's locked with a keypad that wasn't in any of Hayden's official blueprints. I set down the battery I'd been holding. Stay away from that room. Why? What's in there? Nothing that's going to help you. Try me. I looked at her standing there with that stubborn set to her jaw and knew I was going to lose this argument. Julie had the kind of determination that came from loving someone enough to walk into hell to find them. Personal effects, I said finally, from personnel who've been transferred or relocated. Daniel's things are in there. It wasn't a question, so I didn't bother denying it. Why? She asked. If he was transferred to Colorado like the official report said, why are his belongings still here? I walked over to the main door and checked that it was closed, then looked at Julie for a long moment. She deserved the truth, even if it was going to destroy her. Because Daniel never left Antarctica. The words hit her like a physical blow. She actually stepped back, one hand going to the wall for support. What do you mean? I mean, the transfer orders were fake. The accident report from Colorado was fake. Daniel Brady disappeared from Berkner Station, and everything after that was paperwork designed to make people stop asking questions. Then where is he? This was the part I'd been dreading. Something took him. Something. The same something that's been calling your name at night. The same something that made Ian think he was talking to a lost researcher on the radio. I took a breath. The geological survey in 2014 drilled too deep. They found something that should have stayed buried. Julie was staring at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. You're talking about the survey Hayden found. It feeds on identity, I continued. It copies people, learns to wear their faces and speak with their voices. The rules I gave you aren't just safety guidelines, they're containment protocols designed to keep it trapped under the ice. And Daniel? Daniel heard it calling to him using your voice. He was convinced you were in trouble, that you needed help. I tried to stop him, but he was so certain. I trailed off, remembering that final night. He went outside to save you, and it took him. Julie was crying now, but silently, tears streaming down her face without any sound. So when I hear voices calling my name, it's using Daniel's voice to try to get you to make the same mistake he did. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Show me the room. Julie. Show me the goddamn room, Gary. Storage room C was behind an unmarked door that looked like it might lead to a utility closet. The keypad was standard issue, but I'd changed the combination after Daniel's disappearance to something only I would know. Inside, the room was larger than it appeared from outside, lined with metal shelving that held boxes labeled with names and dates. Most of the boxes were old, some dating back years, but Daniel's was near the front, clearly marked and recent enough that the cardboard still looked fresh. Julie opened it with hands that shook slightly. Inside were the usual personal effects: clothes, a few books, a laptop computer, and a leather journal that looked well used. She picked up the journal and flipped through pages covered with Daniel's handwriting. Notes about the station, observations about the staff, sketches of the building layout that looked remarkably similar to the drawings she'd been making. He knew, she whispered. Look at this. She showed me a page where Daniel had written, "The voices aren't random, they're targeted. It knows things about us it shouldn't know, uses memories that aren't its own. 3 maintenance crew visited today, same faces as last month but wrong details. The tall one called me Danny instead of Daniel. Only Julie ever called me that. I read over her shoulder as she turned pages, finding more observations that made my blood run cold. It's learning faster now, getting better at copying, but it can't maintain the copies without the originals nearby. That's why people don't just disappear. They get taken to wherever it keeps them, fed on slowly while it practices being them. Julie looked up at me. This is from 2 weeks before he disappeared. I nodded, remembering how paranoid Daniel had become in those final days, how he'd started questioning everything and everyone around him. There's more, Julie said, flipping to the last entry. Listen to this. Figured out why the rules work. It can't copy someone who's actively resisting, who knows what it is and refuses to engage. The isolation isn't punishment, it's protection. But the moment you start believing the voices, start thinking someone needs help, you become vulnerable to replacement. She closed the journal and looked at me with eyes that held too much understanding. That's why you've been so careful about the rules. You're not just protecting us from it, you're protecting everyone else from us if we get taken. Before I could answer, Hayden's voice echoed from the common room. Gary, you need to see this, now. We found her hunched over her laptop with an expression that suggested she'd uncovered something that made all her previous research look like children's games. The geological survey, she said without preamble. I found the classified sections. How? Someone uploaded them to my laptop. While I was sleeping, files I never downloaded, appearing in directories I never created. She turned the screen toward us. Look at this. The document was heavily redacted, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. The survey team had been drilling core samples to investigate electromagnetic anomalies when they'd broken through into what appeared to be a vast underground chamber. Initial readings suggested the space was much larger than should have been possible given the geological structure of the area. They found something alive down there, Hayden continued, something that had been dormant for possibly thousands of years. The drilling woke it up. What kind of something? Julie asked. The report describes it as parasitic intelligence with adaptive mimicry capabilities. Basically, it copies living organisms to understand them, then uses that understanding to hunt more effectively. Ian appeared in the doorway, drawn by our serious tones. Hunt what? Anything with complex neural patterns. Anything capable of individual identity. Hayden scrolled through more files. According to this, similar entities have been discovered at remote locations around the world, always in areas of geological instability, always awakened by human activity. Are they connected somehow? I asked. Unknown, but every site shows the same pattern. Initial contact followed by personnel disappearances, then containment protocols that amount to permanent isolation. Ian sat down heavily in one of the mismatched chairs. So, we're basically prison guards for something that shouldn't exist. Worse than that, Hayden said. According to the timeline, each site becomes more active over time. The entities learn, adapt, get better at mimicking human behavior. Eventually, containment fails. What happens then? The sites get sterilized, usually with extreme prejudice. The room went quiet, except for the sound of wind rattling the windows. Outside, the short day was already fading into the endless night that would dominate the next few months. There's something else, Hayden said quietly. The files include personnel records for all the Antarctic containment sites. Berkner Station has the longest active period, 3 years without sterilization. Why? Julie asked. Because someone keeps sending it fresh material to study. New recruits every few months, always small groups, always carefully selected. The implication hit all of us at the same time. We weren't here to conduct research or maintain equipment. We were here to feed something that lived under the ice. Gary, Dustin's voice came from the radio corner, calm but with an edge that made everyone turn to look at him. You need to see the camera feeds. I walked over to the monitor that showed exterior views from around the station. Usually, the screens displayed various angles of the same basic scene: white snow, gray sky, the occasional glimpse of outbuildings. Not today. Camera 1 showed the current view, blowing snow and the approaching darkness of polar night. Camera 2 showed the same location, but in what appeared to be bright sunlight with no snow on the ground. Camera 3 displayed the compound as it might have looked years ago, with different buildings and people moving around outside. "How long has it been like this?" I asked. "About 20 minutes, since just after the maintenance crew left." I studied the screen showing people outside. The figures were too distant to make out clearly, but they moved with purpose, going about daily routines in a summer that had never existed at this latitude. "Can you enhance the image?" Dustin adjusted some controls and the figures became clearer. My stomach dropped as I recognized faces, people who had supposedly been transferred or evacuated over the past few years. All of them walking around in weather that couldn't exist, in a version of Berkner Station that wasn't quite right. "Jesus," Ian whispered. "Is that real?" "Define real," I said, but my attention was caught by movement on camera 1, the current feed. 3 figures in blue uniforms were walking back toward the building, moving with the same purposeful stride they'd had during their maintenance work. But now I could see something that had been hidden by distance and poor lighting earlier. One of them had Ian's face. I looked at Ian, who was standing right beside me, staring at the monitor, then back at the screen where his doppelganger approached the north door. "How is that possible?" Ian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer because I was too busy trying to figure out how long the thing wearing Ian's face had been among us, and whether the Ian standing next to me was real or just another copy that had gotten very, very good at pretending to be human. Outside, the maintenance crew reached the north door. The one with Ian's face looked directly at the camera and smiled. By the 4th night, I'd stopped pretending sleep was an option. The common room had become our unofficial headquarters, with Hayden spread across one table surrounded by printed documents, and Julie curled up in the corner chair reading Daniel's journal for probably the 10th time. "Listen to this," Hayden said, looking up from her laptop screen. "I've got files here I never downloaded. Someone, or something, uploaded research papers about parasitic organisms while I was sleeping." "What kind of research?" I asked. "Studies from the 1950s about military experiments with identity replication, tests on prisoners of war to see if personality could be extracted and transferred." She scrolled through pages of dense text. All the subjects died, but the researchers were convinced they'd found evidence of some kind of consciousness transfer. Julie looked up from Daniel's journal. Daniel wrote about memory gaps. Days where he couldn't remember conversations people claimed they'd had with him. That matches what I'm reading here. The copied subjects would have periods where the original personality would surface, fighting against the replacement. Hayden clicked through more files. But each time, the copy would get stronger and the original would fade. Ian wandered in from the kitchen, moving with that same distracted quality he'd had since the radio incident. But tonight something felt different about his movements. Too fluid, like he was concentrating on each step. "Any word on when this storm's supposed to break?" he asked. I glanced at the weather monitor. "What storm?" "The one that's been rattling the windows all evening." The building was completely still. No wind, no rattling, nothing but the usual hum of the heating system. "Ian, there's no storm tonight." He looked confused, then walked over to the main window and pressed his face against the glass. "But I can hear it. Voices in the wind, calling from different directions." Julie and I exchanged glances. In Daniel's journal, he'd written about hearing multiple voices just before his disappearance. "What are they saying?" Julie asked quietly. "They're calling my name, but from everywhere at once, north, south, even from underneath the building." Ian turned away from the window with an expression that was somehow both worried and excited. "I think they need help, Ian." I kept my voice steady. "Step away from the window. But what if someone's really in trouble? What if the maintenance crew got caught in something? The maintenance crew left hours ago. Did they? He tilted his head like he was listening to something none of us could hear. Because I could swear I saw them outside just a few minutes ago. Dustin appeared from the direction of his room, moving with that careful quiet he'd maintained since arrival. "Gary, can I talk to you privately?" I followed him to the radio corner, where he kept his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. "Something's wrong with Ian," he said. "I noticed. The storm that isn't there, voices from underground. No, something else." Dustin glanced back toward where Ian was now standing near the north door, one hand resting on the frame. "Watch his reflection in the window." I looked. Ian was standing perfectly still, but in the glass, his reflection seemed to be moving independently. Small gestures, head turns, expressions that didn't match what Ian was actually doing. "How long has it been like that?" "Since just after the maintenance crew finished their work this afternoon." The maintenance crew. I thought about how efficiently they'd moved, how their tools made no sound, how they'd known exactly where everything was without asking questions. "Dustin, when did you first notice Ian acting strange?" "Right after they checked the heating system in his room. He came out looking confused, said he'd taken a nap but couldn't remember lying down." Jesus Christ. The maintenance crew hadn't been maintaining anything. They'd been making a replacement. "We need to..." Ian's voice cut across the room. "I can hear Julie calling for help." I spun around to see him with his hand on the north door's lock mechanism. Julie was sitting 15 feet away, staring at him in alarm. "Ian, stop," I said, moving toward him. "Julie's right here." "No, she's outside. She's been calling for hours." He started turning the lock. "She says Daniel's with her." Julie jumped up from her chair. "I'm right here, Ian. I haven't been outside." Ian looked at her with the same glassy expression he'd had during the radio incident, then looked back at the door. "But you're outside too. Both of you are outside." That's when the radio crackled to life. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? This is Julie Brady, and I'm lost in the snow outside Berkner Station." I felt the blood drain from my face. Julie's voice was coming through the radio speakers, while Julie stood right next to me. "Please, if anyone's monitoring this frequency, I need help. I can see the lights of the station, but I can't find the entrance. It's so cold, and Daniel's with me, but he's hurt." The Julie standing beside me went white. "That's not me." "Gary." The radio version of Julie's voice was getting weaker, more desperate. "Gary, I know you're in there. Daniel says you can help us. Please open the north door." Ian's hand tightened on the lock. "See? She needs help." "Ian, that's not Julie." I moved closer, but he'd already started turning the mechanism. "That thing is using her voice. But she sounds so scared." "I'm right here," Julie shouted. "I'm standing right next to you." Ian looked at her again, and for a moment his expression cleared, like he was seeing her for the first time. "Julie? Yes, it's me. I'm here, I'm safe, and I'm not outside." "But..." He looked back at the door, confusion clouding his features. "If you're here, then who's been calling for help?" That's when Dustin grabbed Ian's arms and spun him around to face the window. "Look at your reflection, Ian. Really look at it." In the glass, Ian's reflection was smiling, while Ian himself looked confused and frightened. The reflection's mouth moved independently, forming words that didn't match anything Ian was saying. "What the hell?" Ian stared at his own image in horror. That's not me." "No," I said quietly. "It's not." The radio crackled again. "Gary, please. Daniel's getting worse. He says you know what's down here, what's been waiting. He says you've been feeding it fresh minds for years." Ian's reflection in the window mouthed the exact words Julie's voice was speaking through the radio. I looked at the young man standing there, confused, frightened, asking questions that seemed genuine, and realized the horrible truth. The real Ian was already dead. The thing standing in front of us was just getting better at pretending to be him. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you been copying him?" The confusion faded from Ian's face, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. "Since this afternoon," he said, and his voice was slightly different now. Calmer, more confident. The maintenance worker with his face did excellent preparatory work. Julie backed away toward the far wall. Jesus Christ. "The process is much easier when the subject is willing," the Ian copy continued. "He heard his grandfather calling, you see, from the maintenance tunnel. Family voices are particularly effective." Hayden was frantically typing on her laptop. "Gary, look at this. The files about consciousness transfer. They mention using emotional triggers to make subjects compliant." "Where is he?" Julie demanded. "Where's the real Ian?" The copy tilted its head, considering the question. "He's learning to be still. They all learn, eventually." Through the radio, Julie's voice had been joined by others. Male voices, female voices, all calling for help from the darkness outside. Some I recognized, former personnel who'd supposedly been transferred over the past 3 years. "The maintenance crew," I said. "They've been replacing people gradually." "Very gradually," the Ian copy agreed. "1 or 2 per visit, carefully selected. Always the ones who asked too many questions or showed signs of resistance to the containment protocols." I thought about all the veteran staff members who'd been transferred for family emergencies or health concerns. How their replacements had seemed slightly off, just different enough to notice, but not different enough to prove anything. "How many?" I asked. "All of them, eventually. The process has been quite successful." Julie made a strangled sound. "Daniel? Daniel was the first complete success. He provided excellent baseline data for improving the replication process." The copy smiled with Ian's face. "His emotional attachment to family made him particularly easy to manipulate." The radio voices were getting louder, more insistent. I could make out at least 6 different people calling for help, all claiming to be lost in the snow, all asking for the north door to be opened. "Gary," Dustin said quietly, "look outside." Through the main window, I could see figures moving in the snow, distant at first, but getting closer. People in various winter gear, all walking toward the station with the same purposeful stride the maintenance crew had used. As they got closer, I started recognizing faces. Dr. Peterson, who'd been transferred 8 months ago. Sarah Martinez, evacuated for a family emergency. Tom Wilson, medical emergency that required immediate evacuation. All of them walking across the ice like it was a summer day, their faces visible in the station's exterior lights, even though the temperature outside was 40 below zero. "They've been building an army," I whispered. "Not an army," the Ian copy corrected. "A community. Soon you'll all join us outside. Won't that be nice?" Julie's voice through the radio had become a chorus now. Multiple versions of her calling from different directions, each one claiming to be the real one in need of rescue. "Julie, Daniel, and I have been having such wonderful conversations," the copy continued, "about family, about loyalty, about the things people will do for love. You'd be amazed how much we've learned." I looked at Julie, pale and shaking, but still standing her ground. At Hayden, whose hands had stopped moving on her keyboard as she stared at the approaching figures outside. At Dustin, who was watching everything with an expression I couldn't read. And at the thing wearing Ian's face, smiling with genuine warmth as it explained how everyone we'd thought was safe was actually dead. "The fascinating thing about identity," it said, "is how little of it is actually essential. Memory, personality, even physical appearance, all of it can be replicated with sufficient study. The only difference is intent." "What do you want?" I asked. "To understand. To become. to ensure that human consciousness continues, even if humans themselves prove too fragile for this environment. The copy's smile widened. We're offering immortality, Gary. A chance to live forever in perfect forms that never feel cold, never feel pain, never feel loss. Outside, the figures had reached the compound perimeter. I counted at least 12 people, all of them former Berkner station personnel, all of them looking up at our windows with expressions of patient expectation. All we need, the Ian copy said, is for someone to open the door. I looked at the thing wearing Ian's face as it finished explaining the entity's generous offer of immortality, and felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with Antarctic weather. How thoughtful, I said, keeping my voice level. But I think we'll pass. The Ian copy's smile never wavered. I understand the reluctance. It's a significant transition. Behind me, Julie made a soft sound of agreement. Too soft. Too measured. I'd known Julie for 4 days now, and she responded to threats with anger, not resignation. I turned to look at her, really look at her, and noticed things I'd been too distracted to catch before. The way she held her head at exactly the same angle she'd maintained for the past hour. How her breathing was perfectly regular despite the stress. The complete absence of the nervous habits. Touching her brother's ring, running her hand through her hair, that had defined her since arrival. Julie, I said quietly. When did Daniel give you that ring? She blinked once, slowly. On my 18th birthday. Wrong answer. Daniel's ring was his class ring from college. Julie had mentioned wearing it to remember him, but she'd never said it was a gift. I glanced at Hayden, who was still typing on her laptop with mechanical precision. Her hands moved across the keys in exactly the same pattern they'd used for the past 2 hours, even though her screen was displaying a blue error message. Dustin stood near the radio console, maintaining that careful observation pose he'd held since arriving at the station. But now I realized his stillness wasn't natural caution. It was the uncanny valley stillness of something that had to concentrate on remembering to move. How long? I asked the Ian copy. Different timelines for each subject. Dustin was the first, replaced on the second day after the initial radio contact. His compliance made the process quite smooth. I thought about Dustin's perfect behavior, his helpful suggestions, his apparent concern for group welfare. All of it performance, carefully studied and replicated. Hayden was more challenging, the copy continued. Her analytical nature required a more gradual approach. We needed 3 days to fully map her personality patterns. 3 days. Right around the time she'd started finding files on her laptop that she claimed not to have downloaded. And Julie? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Yesterday evening. She was so focused on her brother's journal that she didn't notice when the voices outside stopped calling her name and started calling yours instead. The radio crackled with what sounded like my own voice, distant and distressed, calling for help from somewhere in the snow. Even the real Ian had been replaced before I'd noticed, probably during his first shift monitoring the radio. I was alone in a room full of perfect copies, all of them watching me with the patient interest of predators who'd already won. The fascinating aspect, the Dustin copy said, is how long it took you to notice. 3 days of training us to be more human, refining our behavioral patterns, teaching us to blend in. They were right. I'd been conducting the same briefings I'd given dozens of times before, but instead of preparing humans for survival, I'd been training the entity to be better at wearing human faces. So, what happens now? I asked. Now you join us, the Julie copy said with Julie's voice, but none of her fire. Voluntarily, if possible. The process is much more efficient with cooperation. Through the window, the figures outside had moved closer to the building. Former personnel, all wearing faces I recognized, all waiting with the same patient expectation. I looked at the 4 copies surrounding me and made the only choice that made sense. I need to use the bathroom first. The Ian copy nodded graciously. Of course. Take your time. I walked toward the back of the building, moving at the same casual pace I'd maintained for 4 days of careful routine. But instead of heading to the bathroom, I turned toward the storage area where we kept the emergency winter gear. Storage room C was still unlocked from earlier. Inside, past the shelves of personal effects, was a utility door that led to the building's external maintenance areas. It wasn't marked on any of the blueprints Hayden had found, because it was designed for situations exactly like this one. The emergency communication array was housed in a separate building 50 yards north of the main station. It ran on independent power and had enough range to reach every Antarctic facility within 1,000 miles. I grabbed the heaviest parka I could find, pulled on insulated gloves and boots, and checked that the emergency radio was still clipped to the gear belt. Then I looked at the utility door and the manual lock that would take me outside into conditions that killed people in minutes. The first rule of Berkner Station was never go outside after dark. I'd enforced that rule for 3 years, watched it keep people alive through countless Antarctic nights. I turned the lock and stepped into hell. The cold hit like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and freezing the moisture in my nostrils instantly. The wind screamed across the ice with enough force to knock me sideways, carrying snow that felt like ground glass against any exposed skin. But I could see the communication array through the blowing snow. A small concrete building with a radio tower that rose 30 feet into the darkness. 50 yards across open ground that might as well have been 50 miles. I put my head down and started walking. The wind tried to push me off course, howling around me with voices that called my name from every direction. Not just my name. Promises, pleas, threats, all delivered in voices I recognized. My ex-wife asking me to come home. My father, dead for 15 years, telling me he was proud. Daniel Brady screaming that he needed help. I kept walking. Halfway across the open ground, a figure approached from the left. Someone wearing Julie's face but moving with the wrong gait, calling to me in Hayden's voice. "Gary, you don't need to do this. Come back inside where it's warm." I looked at the thing wearing 2 identities like badly matched clothes, its features shifting slightly as it spoke, and understood that the copying process wasn't perfect. The entity could mimic individual people well enough to fool casual observation, but when it tried to combine multiple identities, the results became grotesque. More figures emerged from the blowing snow. I counted at least 20 people, all former Berkner Station personnel, all wearing faces that belonged to the dead. They moved with purpose but not coordination, like actors who'd forgotten their blocking. Gary, a new voice, and this one made me stop walking entirely. Daniel Brady approached through the snow, but he wore Julie's face while speaking in Ian's voice. The combination was wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly, like an optical illusion that violated basic principles of reality. "You can't warn them," the Daniel-Julie-Ian fusion said. "Even if you reach the radio, they won't believe you. Who's going to accept a report about monsters under the ice?" "They don't have to believe me," I said through numb lips. "They just have to stay away." I started walking again, pushing past the fusion entity toward the communication building. The wind was getting worse, but I could see the door now, 20 yards ahead. "The containment protocols were never about protection," the fusion continued, keeping pace beside me. "They were about isolation, keeping us trapped until someone could find a permanent solution." "I know. But there is no solution, Gary. We've been waiting for 3 years for someone smart enough or strong enough to destroy us permanently. Instead, you've been feeding us fresh minds to study." 15 yards, 10. The communication building's door was reinforced metal with a manual lock that couldn't be controlled remotely. Every new batch of recruits helped us understand human behavior better. Every briefing taught us how to blend in more effectively. You've been our most valuable teacher. I reached the door and fumbled with frozen fingers to work the lock mechanism. The metal was so cold it burned through my gloves, but the mechanism turned. No one's coming to save you, Gary. And even if they did, how would they tell the real humans from the copies? I got the door open and stumbled inside. The communication building was barely warmer than outside. but it blocked the wind. Emergency power kept minimal lighting running, enough to see the radio equipment mounted on metal racks along the walls. The main transmitter was military grade, designed to punch through atmospheric interference and reach satellite relays. I powered it up and watched indicator lights come to life as the system ran through its startup sequence. Behind me, the door opened and the fusion entity stepped inside, its mismatched features now clearly visible in the electric light. Julie's eyes in Daniel's face, speaking with Ian's voice while Hayden's mannerisms leaked through the performance. "This is pointless," it said. "Even if you transmit, who will you warn? And what will you tell them?" I pulled the microphone close and began transmitting on the emergency frequency that every Antarctic facility monitored around the clock. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Berkner Station transmitting emergency alert to all Antarctic operations. Do not approach Berkner Station. Do not send personnel or supply flights. Maintain minimum 100-mile exclusion zone around our coordinates." Static filled the speakers. Then a voice responded. "Berkner Station, this is McMurdo Base. Please clarify nature of emergency." "Biological contamination," I transmitted. "Unknown pathogen with 100% infection rate. All personnel at Berkner Station are compromised. Station is under permanent quarantine." "Berkner Station, are you requesting medical evacuation?" I looked at the fusion entity watching me with multiple people's faces. "Negative, do not attempt rescue. Facility is non-recoverable. Maintain exclusion zone until further notice." "Gary, this is unnecessary," the entity said. "We're offering evolution, not extinction." I ignored it and kept transmitting. "McMurdo Base, log this transmission as final communication from Berkner Station. Facility is lost. Recommend sterilization protocols if exclusion zone is breached. Berkner Station, please confirm." I switched off the radio and looked around the communication building for what I needed. Emergency protocols required multiple safeguards to prevent accidental destruction of critical equipment, but they also included provisions for deliberate sabotage in extreme circumstances. The thermite charges were stored in a locked cabinet marked with radiation warnings. Military-grade incendiary devices designed to destroy sensitive equipment beyond any possibility of recovery or reverse engineering. I armed the first charge and placed it against the main transmitter array. "Gary." The fusion entity's voice had changed, becoming softer, more pleading. "You're condemning yourself along with us." "I know." I armed the second charge and positioned it near the satellite uplink equipment. 2 minutes on the timer, enough to get clear of the building, but not enough to reach the main station. "The people you're trying to protect, they'll never know you saved them." I armed the third charge and set it against the backup communication system. "That's the point." The timer displays showed 90 seconds remaining. I walked toward the door, past the entity that wore too many faces at once. "You don't have to die out here, Gary. Come back inside. Join us. We can make you better than you were." I opened the door and stepped back into the screaming wind. "No thanks." Behind me, the communication building erupted in white-hot flame as the thermite charges ignited simultaneously. The explosion lit up the snow for hundreds of yards, revealing the full scope of the horror that surrounded Berkner Station. Dozens of figures stood motionless in the drifts, all of them wearing faces of people who were supposed to be dead. They watched the burning building with expressions of mild disappointment, like spectators at a sporting event where their team had lost a close game. I started walking back toward the main station, knowing I wouldn't make it halfway before the cold finished what I'd started. But that was fine. I'd done what needed doing. The wind began to die down as I trudged through the snow, and the figures around me started moving again. Not toward me, but back toward whatever holes they'd crawled out of. The show was over. By the time I could see the main building's lights, my feet had gone completely numb and my hands were useless frozen clubs inside my gloves. But the lights looked warm and welcoming, and I could see familiar faces waiting for me in the windows. Julie, concerned about my welfare. Hayden, probably worried about the implications of my actions. Dustin, ready to help however he could. Ian, wondering what had taken me so long. All of them perfect copies, wearing the personalities of people who'd died days ago while I'd been training their killers to be more convincing. I reached the north door and stood there for a moment, looking at the lock mechanism that had kept the entity contained for 3 years. Rule 1. Never go outside after dark. Rule 2. Ignore voices calling from outside. Rule 3. Acknowledge but don't engage with maintenance crew. All of it designed to keep the thing under the ice trapped in its frozen prison until someone could find a real solution. But there was no solution, and the containment had failed the moment the first copy walked through this door. I turned the lock and stepped inside, where the warmth hit me like a physical embrace, and familiar voices welcomed me home. "Gary," the Julie copy said, rushing to help me out of my frozen gear. "Thank God you're back. We were so worried." "Are you hurt?" the Hayden copy asked, taking my arm to steady me. "What happened out there?" the Dustin copy wanted to know. And Ian, the thing wearing Ian's face, smiled with genuine warmth as it helped me toward a chair by the heater. "The communication equipment," it said. "I assume it's no longer functional?" "That's right," I said, letting them guide me to warmth and safety. "Good," the Ian copy said. "We wouldn't want anyone to worry unnecessarily." I sat down and let the heat begin thawing my frozen hands while 4 perfect copies of dead people made sure I was comfortable. Outside, the wind had stopped entirely, leaving Berkner Station wrapped in the kind of absolute silence that only existed at the bottom of the world. Soon, I knew, I'd join the wanderers in the snow, another mask for the thing that lived under the ice. Another identity for it to wear when the next group of researchers arrived to study whatever was left of this place. But at least the contamination would stay here, buried in Antarctica's endless winter, where it belonged. I closed my eyes and waited to stop being Gary Spencer forever.